The night in London was unusually stifling. A thin mist drifted down over the old cobblestone streets, so cold it seemed even the breath of those passing by froze in the air. The wind slipped through narrow gaps between buildings, sneaking past shuttered windows, carrying with it a strange, smoky scent, as if from an abandoned fireplace, mixed with the damp odor of a city after rain. The dull yellow glow of the streetlights spread unevenly across the gray stone pavement, casting long, distorted shadows like invisible hands lurking from afar. At the corner of a narrow alley, a stray dog trembled, growling softly as if it could sense something ominous creeping through the night air. The faint clinking of its chain echoed sharply, cold and metallic, like a warning of something dark about to unfold. At the far end of the street, beneath the pale bluish light of a lonely traffic lamp, a figure appeared. It was a young woman in a blue raincoat, her neck wrapped in a wool scarf, walking steadily through the cold night, like anyone heading home after an ordinary evening. Yet tonight, the air felt different. The wind wound through the narrow lanes, mist settled on the ground, and the dim light stretched her shadow long and thin, as if an unseen presence were trailing just behind her. Each step echoed clearly, bouncing off the old brick walls and returning in a haunting rhythm, a faint warning hanging suspended in the air. And you, what time is it where you're listening to this story? Outside your window, does the sky still hold a trace of fading light, or has night already swallowed it whole? Do you feel safe right now? Have you ever thought that even the most familiar street, the one you walk every evening, could hide something dark and unthinkable beneath its calm surface? If you happen to see someone in uniform, wearing a badge, appearing disciplined and trustworthy, have you ever wondered if behind that facade might lie a man weighed down by guilt? Tonight's story is about a young woman named Sarah Everard, 33 years old, beautiful, and full of life. She lived a simple, steady existence. Born and raised in York to a middle-class family, Sarah was taught from a young age to be kind, considerate, and always mindful of her own safety. After graduating with a degree in geography from Durham University, she moved to London to build her career, renting a small flat in Brixton only a few miles from where she would be abducted. She worked for a marketing company, commuting each morning by train to the office and returning each evening along the same familiar route. Her friends described her as gentle, intelligent, and gifted with the kind of empathy that made her a rare friend in one's lifetime. She loved long evening walks, light red wine, and quiet instrumental indie music, the kind that could fill the silences of the city. Sarah had been in serious relationships before, yet what defined her was never romance, but her steadiness and her unwavering belief that people could still choose to be kind to one another. In recent months, she was in a stable relationship, the kind built on small, quiet plans for the future. Short weekend trips, nights cooking together in their small kitchen, dreams of a little house near the park. Her boyfriend, Josh Loth, later recalled that they spoke on the phone that very night. An ordinary conversation that ended with a promise to see each other over the weekend. Ahead of her, Clapham Common lay still under the mist. Rows of leafless trees stood rigid like frozen silhouettes. The park lights were weak, barely bright enough to illuminate the patches of fog drifting low, turning the scene into something like a dark stage where all sound was swallowed whole. Sarah had always believed her city was safe enough for a short evening walk, especially along a familiar route. Walking helped her unwind after a long day, a small ritual that gave her a rare sense of freedom amid the rush of London life. That evening was no different. She had just left a close friend's house after a dinner full of laughter. The air still carried traces of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the faint scent of food lingering on her coat. A car passed by, slowing as its headlights swept across her figure, then vanished into the corner. The engine faded into the distance, but a chill crept up her spine and stayed there. At the junction where two streets met, her shadow broke, then disappeared into a stretch of darkness, so deep and cold it seemed to swallow every trace of warmth. That moment marked the invisible line between an ordinary night and a tragedy that would shake all of Britain. Throughout her life, Sarah had never been one to seek confrontation or attention. She preferred a quiet existence, respectful and measured, always keeping a safe distance from chaos. Perhaps that was why, when her phone suddenly went silent that night, no one thought it was a technical issue or a moment of distraction. Instinct, tense and unspoken, spread among those who loved her. Within hours, London, usually bursting with noise, seemed to tighten in on itself, suffocating in its silence. There was something subtly off about that hour. On Pointers Road, a truck's horn blared somewhere far away, echoing faintly through the mist like a signal lost in the dark. The smell of wood smoke drifted between cold gusts of wind, mixing with the damp breath of the pavement, a warning of something unseen drawing near. Sarah kept walking briskly, her posture slightly withdrawn, passing in front of a doorbell camera of a nearby house. That image, captured by chance, would later become her final known moment. Walking along the A205 toward Tulse Hill, head slightly bowed in the winter night. Everything about it seemed ordinary enough to chill the blood. The short walk from her friend's home to her own, barely 15 minutes, became her final journey. And on that quiet street, the faint light of a doorbell camera would unknowingly record the moment Britain would never forget. The next morning, as the pale spring sunlight fell over Brixton, a faint unease began to seep into the house where Sarah Everard should have returned the night before. Her phone had been silent all night, no messages, no calls, something that had never happened before. Sarah was always careful, always sending a text saying, "Home safe," after going out in the evening, a small habit that gave her family peace of mind. But this time, the screen remained dark. When her boyfriend tried calling again and again with no answer, a cold dread crept down his spine. They retraced her usual route, the short 15-minute walk from her friend's house to her flat, and the question hung heavy in the air. Where could she have vanished in such a brief span of time? Worry quickly turned to alarm. Her family contacted the police. Friends began posting her photo on social media, and London's community groups shared missing person alerts across every platform. Investigators traced her phone signal and reviewed the roadside CCTV. The last sighting of her was at the corner of Pointers Road, head slightly lowered, hands in her coat pockets, walking briskly past a house with a doorbell camera. After that, nothing. No calls, no location signal, no trace. The silence itself became more terrifying than any noise could be. Her mother, Susan, would never forget that moment. In a trembling voice later, she recalled how her heart began to tighten the instant the phone rang, and it wasn't Sarah on the line. She had raised a daughter who always reassured those around her, thoughtful, punctual, and never the type to disappear without a word. A mother's intuition told her something was terribly wrong, something monstrous, unfolding somewhere beyond the city. I couldn't talk to her again. I couldn't hold her one last time, she would later say. The words hung in the air like an unspoken verdict, as if deep down she had already known an invisible door had closed forever. The Everard family always described Sarah as someone who lived for others, kind, grounded, radiant with quiet light. She was not someone who caused worry. That was what made her sudden silence all the more horrifying. As police cordoned off the Clapham area and scoured every nearby camera, they found no signs of panic, no struggle, no desperate attempt to flee. Everything had unfolded quietly, as though she had been swallowed whole by the night itself. A passing driver later recalled that the scene looked so ordinary it was unsettling. He had seen a man dressed like a police officer, with a duty belt at his waist, and his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, standing beside a woman. On the pavement, there was no shouting, no sign of struggle, just a heavy, eerie silence under the yellow streetlight that cast their shadows onto the wet ground. In that moment, he believed it was nothing more than a routine stop. A police officer doing his job. There was no reason to suspect anything. Only minutes later, as the street emptied and fell quiet, a white car appeared and slowed to a stop by the curb. Its headlights sliced through the fog like a blade, then dimmed abruptly. A man stepped out, dressed like an off-duty officer, wearing a dark jacket, calm posture, and eyes that seemed deliberate, calculating. It was Wayne Couzens, 48 years old at the time, carrying out a plan he had already prepared. He approached Sarah, held out a set of documents, his voice steady yet carrying the counterfeit authority of a man in uniform. In that instant, Sarah's instincts tightened her body, but the glint of his badge and his composed tone convinced her this was simply an official check. He mentioned a COVID regulation breach and asked to see her identification, nothing unusual in a city still under strict restrictions. Sarah paused, took a small step back, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her wallet. She didn't scream. She had no reason to run. Confronted with a man who looked like the embodiment of law and order, she reacted with the same trust any ordinary citizen would. Couzens squinted slightly, lowering his gaze with a feigned look of sympathy, the kind that says, "I'm only doing my job." No one nearby heard their brief exchange. No other car passed at that fatal moment. Then, in an instant, the illusion became a trap. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the movement so quick, so precise, it was almost soundless, and locked them tightly around Sarah's wrists under the dim amber glow of the streetlight. It happened in seconds, too fast to resist, too controlled to cry out. He led her toward the back seat of the rented car, pushed her inside. The door slammed shut, and the metallic click of the lock rang out cold, final, sealing the end of a life that had only moments earlier been so achingly ordinary. Later, everything was pieced together into a stark, unforgiving truth. The killer had staged a fake arrest, exploiting the social distancing rules of the pandemic. When Sarah walked by, he appeared calm, composed, flashing identification, his tone steady as he demanded to see her papers. Like any law-abiding citizen, she stopped, uneasy but compliant. Standing before someone who represented authority, she had no reason to run. Within minutes, he had handcuffed her, led her to the white rental car, and drove out of London into the night, heading toward Kent. Police would later determine the time of her abduction, 9:34 p.m. 3 minutes later, the vehicle had already left the South Circular. No one heard a scream. No one noticed anything strange. Clapham's night stayed quiet, perfectly still, while inside that car, a woman was trapped by the very man society had trusted to protect her. When police lights eventually flooded the streets of Clapham, when search teams combed every alley, when thousands of flyers bearing Sarah's face spread across the city, her family came to understand something unspeakable. The most terrifying things don't always make a sound. Some deaths are premeditated in absolute silence, like that night, when a mother waited for her daughter to come home, and the door never opened. As the night deepened, it tightened around Sarah Everard like a slow, invisible fire. There was no phone signal, no familiar streetlight glow, no passerby to witness what was unfolding. Wayne Couzens had built the perfect trap not through violence or chaos, but through counterfeit authority and the cold precision of a man who understood exactly how humans react to a uniform. When the car door shut, the faint metallic click echoed like a sealed verdict. He pulled Sarah into the back seat, deftly fastening the seatbelt across her body, then locking it in place. There was no wild struggle, only a series of chillingly methodical movements, carried out with the mechanical ease of someone who had rehearsed them 100 times. When she tried to twist around, to say something, he clenched his jaw and muttered under his breath, "You've broken the lockdown rules." The words weren't shouted, but the slow, measured way he spoke them like a decree froze her in place. In that instant, she wasn't just facing a stranger. She was facing the embodiment of the law she had been taught to trust. The car left London at 9:37 p.m., gliding through empty streets toward the highway. As the city lights faded behind them, the only sounds inside were the rush of wind against the windows and the faint hum from the dashboard's dim glow. On the floor, dry leaves clung to Couzens's shoes, falling in scattered fragments, lifeless traces of where he had been. Sarah sat motionless, her body pinned in place, the seatbelt drawn tight across her chest, her wrists locked together with handcuffs threaded neatly through the belt, so she couldn't twist free. Near his waist gleamed his service pistol, the metallic glint catching the light every time the car jolted over a bump. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air in the car was thick, stale, claustrophobic, as if the very atmosphere were closing in. The radio was on, but there was no music, only a dull, static hum, the kind of silence that swallowed sound whole, just like the city disappearing behind them. Every passing mile marked another mile between her and the possibility of rescue. As the car entered the Dartford Tunnel, fractured light slid across the roof, streaking over her terrified face, before vanishing again when the tires hit the long, empty Kent roads. Cousin's plan had been meticulous. He knew the COVID checkpoints. He knew when the roads would be quiet. He knew exactly what to say to make someone believe they were being lawfully detained. To an ordinary citizen, being stopped by a police officer meant obedience, fear disguised as respect. Sarah had just left a friend's home, a simple evening visit, the kind of situation that could easily convince her she had broken a lockdown rule without realizing it. That was why she didn't struggle right away. Why she didn't scream. The trap was crafted from trust, the very thing he had chosen to violate and corrupt. Cousins didn't need noise or violence. He used the law itself as an invisible rope, weaving it through bureaucratic gestures that appeared legitimate. By the time Sarah realized this was not a routine stop, the car was already too far from London. The darkness had swallowed every trace of civilization. No witnesses, no traffic cameras, no headlights on the road, only him, her, and the endless black of Kent, stretching like a world without exit. Inside that narrow car, hope began to fracture into silent shards. Sarah couldn't yet know that this was the point of no return. But Cousins, he knew it perfectly. He had been preparing for this night all along. At a small rest stop along the highway toward Dover, under the flickering haze of yellow lights, Wayne Cousins' car suddenly came to a halt. The air outside was unnervingly still, only the faint hum of the idling engine and the whisper of wind threading through bare trees. The parking area was nearly deserted, a few trucks lined up along the curb like silent blocks of steel. Inside the car, the air had thickened into something almost solid, time itself slowing down. Sarah sat bent forward, her wrists still bound tightly behind her, her eyes darting across the darkness, catching only fragments of dim light and shadow. He opened the door, stepped out, and inhaled deeply, the way a man might, before carrying out a ritual he had rehearsed 1,000 times. From the boot, he pulled out the items he had prepared in advance: a roll of black duct tape, zip ties, a few small tools neatly arranged inside a plastic bag. None of it was spontaneous. Every move had been planned like a script: renting the car, choosing roads with fewer cameras, selecting a secluded stop, calculating the timing to perfection so that no one would notice. He dragged Sarah toward the back seat. The amber light from the street lamps spilled across her terrified face through the car window. Cousins knelt in front of her, saying nothing, peeling the tape and wrapping it around her wrists, layer by layer, pulling it tight. The sound of the tape tearing through the night was sharp and merciless, like the rhythm of a cruel symphony. He moved on to her ankles, binding them until every movement became futile. When she recoiled instinctively, his hand pressed against her back, cold, heavy, metallic. That touch, deliberate, unhurried, devoid of humanity, was the moment she knew she was in the hands of someone who no longer saw her as a person. The car started again after only a few minutes, minutes that stretched like a lifetime. On the desolate highway, the clock read 10 p.m. He accelerated, slicing through the dark lanes, the road ahead black and endless, swallowing every sound. Within half an hour, the car had traveled more than 100 miles, deep into Kent, the place he had chosen to end her story. Throughout that drive, Cousins remained unnervingly calm, as if nothing unusual was happening. He even made phone calls to family members, speaking in a steady, detached tone, betraying not a single tremor. At another brief stop, he pulled into a Costa cafe, bought a slice of tart and a bottle of orange juice. The cashier had no idea that the man before them, neat, polite, composed, was a predator in transit, with his captive trapped just meters away in the dark. He ate behind the wheel, unhurried, taking small bites like someone preparing to resume a late shift, while inside the car, Sarah sat bound in the blackness, her heart pounding violently in the suffocating terror of a night with no way out. The peak of that night's violence unfolded beneath a sky of solid black, starless, and cold, in a remote woodland about 20 miles from Ashford. The dirt path leading into the forest seemed to swallow all light, leaving only the crunch of tires over damp gravel and the labored breathing of a man who looked human but carried a monster's soul. Wayne Couzens stopped the car in a clearing, far from any houses, far from any watchful eyes. Inside the vehicle, now a moving prison, Sarah remained bound, her wrists burning from the tape that cut into her skin, her ankles raw and immobile. She knew then that this was no arrest, no misunderstanding. This was where her life would end. He dragged her out of the car, pulling her down onto the cold, wet ground, forcing her body against the rear of the vehicle. Darkness enveloped them like a shroud. Couzens removed the police belt he had worn all night, the counterfeit symbol of power he had weaponized, and looped it around Sarah's neck. When he pulled, the sound of leather tightening against flesh sliced through the air, blending with the wind that hissed through the skeletal trees. Sarah struggled, but her strength was gone. There was no escape. In her final breath, she inhaled the freezing air sharp as needles, and then the world fell silent. No cries for help, no witnesses, only a death both quiet and merciless. At trial, forensic experts confirmed the cause of death as compression of the neck, a method that cuts off both air and blood flow, leaving the victim conscious as they slowly suffocate. Couzens later told a psychiatrist that he had killed her using that same belt, a confession that matched the post-mortem findings. A gifted young woman, a beloved friend, a devoted daughter, all erased in a few unbearable hours in the freezing woods of Kent. But he didn't stop there. Wayne Couzens's cruelty went far beyond murder. After confirming that Sarah was dead, he retrieved a can of gasoline from the car boot, pouring it over her folded body. When he set it alight, the forest erupted into a grotesque glow, smoke curling thick and heavy into the air. He stood there, motionless, watching as the flames devoured her inch by inch, fabric by fabric, strand by strand, as though he were burning away every trace that proved she had ever existed. He didn't stop there. Couzens had even prepared a large industrial cooler in advance, turning it into a makeshift cremation chamber. The body, the clothes, Sarah's phone all fed into the fire that night. The acrid stench spread through the damp forest air, merging with the mist to form a suffocating haze, as if a curse had settled over the woods. When the flames died down, he dragged what was left toward a nearby pond. Piece by piece, he stuffed the remains into large black builder's bags he had bought days before, the kind used for hauling rubble. The first stone hit the water with a hollow plunk, and the body sank, swallowed by the dense, freezing darkness below. On March 10, during an intensive search across Kent, police dogs detected one of those builder's bags deep inside Hode's wood. When it was pulled to the surface, a fragment of blue fabric sleeve emerged, the first unmistakable clue. Inside, the partially decomposed body had taken on a waxy, hardened texture, the skin pale and fixed in silent accusation. Investigators immediately sealed off the area and began the formal identification process. Deputy Commissioner Nick Fgrave stood before the cameras and spoke the words that froze the nation. A formal identification has been completed. I can confirm that the body found is that of Sarah Everard. His voice fell like a blade into the air, cutting through the last thread of fragile hope that her family had been clinging to for 8 unbearable days. London, from that moment on, would never be the same again. The investigation erupted like a storm. It was no longer a missing person case, but a full-scale hunt through every shadow of a calculated, cold-blooded night. Specialist officers scoured every inch of land near Dover, examined every highway route, every rest stop, every surveillance camera across miles of countryside. What Couzens thought he had erased each trace, Each supposedly perfect move was slowly pulled back into the light. Sarah's phone was the first breakthrough. A diver searching the waters near Sandwich found it wedged between mud and debris, the casing intact, though the screen was cracked. Inside the device, the location data and final timestamp remained silent, irrefutable evidence. He had believed that throwing it into a drain would erase everything, but it became the very line that dragged him out of the dark. The SIM card had been smashed into fragments, scattered across the floor of the rented car. Yet one shard, lodged in the plastic groove beside the passenger seat, was enough to dismantle his fabricated alibi under interrogation. His digital footprints and his literal ones lay everywhere. CCTV footage from the Dover port showed him moving briskly through a parking lot at night, his demeanor calm, collected. The rental car documents matched the exact time of Sarah's abduction. A fuel receipt dated March 5 showed his purchase of 50 liters of petrol. Each small piece of evidence was stitched together into a tightening rope, drawing the killer out from behind the facade of his police badge, exposing him for what he truly was, a predator in uniform. On Sarah's body, forensic testing found traces of semen, a perfect DNA match to Wayne Cousin's. There was no room left for excuses, no path to denial. He had kidnapped, raped, and murdered her with deliberate intent. And he had made a fatal mistake. He left behind too many traces, convinced he was smarter than the very system of law he once served. Investigators expanded their search to the security systems around his home and even the military databases to which he had previously had access. Surveillance footage from his apartment hallway showed him returning in the early hours of the morning, walking calmly, almost casually, as though he had just finished another night shift. There was no trace of panic, no attempt to hide, no flicker of guilt. The coldest discovery came from an audio log hidden in his call history. On the very night he kidnapped and murdered Sarah, Cousins had phoned a family member. His tone, light, almost gentle, saying he needed to take the family dog to the vet because it gets anxious when left alone too long. A normal call, a harmless sentence, yet that ordinary calm was what chilled the interrogation room to the bone. It wasn't the voice of a man terrified of what he'd done. It was the voice of a hunter executing a plan. Later, in questioning, Cousins tried to fabricate a grotesque story, claiming he had been blackmailed by a criminal gang and forced to kidnap the girl. But every piece of evidence, the CCTV footage, eyewitness statements, fuel receipts, mobile data, and the DNA on Sarah's body tore his lie apart. The so-called gang had never existed. There was only one man, wrapped in the disguise of a police uniform, who used it to steal the life of a woman just trying to walk home. It was all deceit. And that deceit strangled every last word of his defense, leaving behind an investigation file that was clinical, complete, and merciless, a document that captured, in excruciating detail, the moment darkness crushed the light on that early March night. At the historic trial at the Old Bailey, Wayne Cousins faced the heaviest sentence the British justice system could deliver: a full life order, with no possibility of parole. In the vast courtroom, harsh white light fell across the face of the killer, who once wore a police uniform, now standing before the family of the woman he had abducted, raped, and murdered. The proceedings lasted 2 days. Not once did he shed a tear of remorse. While he stood motionless, the people who loved Sarah sat frozen in grief, caught in a silence too heavy for words. But what ignited the fury of the British public, the kind that burns down to the bone, was not only the crime itself, but everything that had come before it. The warnings ignored, the opportunities lost, the system that had quietly allowed him to exist. Later investigations revealed that Wayne Cousins was not an unknown man who suddenly turned into a murderer. The signs had been there, bright and unmistakable. In the 2 years before he killed Sarah, he had been reported at least 3 times for indecent exposure incidents that took place in a McDonald's car park and along a highway. The women who came forward gave full accounts, even noting his license plate and physical details. Yet each report was brushed aside, dismissed without serious inquiry. No disciplinary action was taken. He continued to serve as a police officer, still wearing the belt of authority, still entrusted with the power to stop civilians on the street. Even more chilling, Cousins had been assigned to the Diplomatic Protection Command, a unit responsible for guarding embassies and government sites. A man with a record of sexual misconduct was placed in a position symbolizing security and trust. And it was precisely that trust, that badge of authority, he weaponized to abduct an innocent woman. Public outrage erupted because of this betrayal. People realized Sarah Everard was not only the victim of a predator, she was the victim of a system that had enabled him, ignored the red flags, and handed him the uniform that made his crime possible. When the sentence was delivered, Judge Adrian Fulford did not hide his contempt. "The defendant has not shown the slightest remorse for his grotesque crimes," he declared. He described Cousins's actions as a fundamental betrayal of the public's trust in those appointed to protect it. In the end, Cousins was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a whole life order, effectively a living death sentence, reserved for the kind of murderer society never wishes to see outside prison walls again. In his closing remarks, Justice Fulford said, "She was a talented, kind, entirely innocent young woman made the victim of a course of conduct that was as dreadful as it was devastating." The words echoed through the courtroom like a judgment not just on one man, but on an entire institution that had once allowed him to wear a police badge and hunt under its name. From that moment on, the name Wayne Cousins became a symbol of collective rage, not only for what he had done, but for everything that should have stopped him long before it was too late.